Daisy.
And I'm Terri.
And this is the Monday Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 243. And this week it is Terri's turn to share something. Terri, what do you have?
Well, Daisy, today I have something I'm going to share from a podcast that I listened to. I don't think I've ever shared from this podcast before, but maybe. It's from the folks who do TED Talks. It's like called the TED Talk Collection or something, but the name of the podcast is How to Be a Better Human.
Always a good thing to aim for.
And this episode specifically is How to Be Less Cynical.
Ooh, definitely useful. It's a trap I fall into often.
The host of the podcast name is Chris Duffy, and in this episode, he has Jamil Zaki with him. Jamil Zaki is a psychologist at Stanford University and does a lot of social science research and has written 2 books, and I thought these were interesting topics. The first book is called The War for Kindness, Building Empathy in a Fractured World. And the second book is Hope for Cynics, The Surprising Science of Human Goodness. So, thinking of being a better human, these are probably things that would help us. But one of the things that interested me in this interview, they spent some time just talking in general about whether people change. And I thought, geez, Daisy and I could probably talk about that for hours. Like, do we think people can really change? Because there are many people who are very cynical about that they think that people do not change. Jamil quotes a famous study where they asked people if they think people change over time. And when they asked people in their 30s, they said, oh yeah, I've changed a lot in the past 10 years. I'm very different. 20-year-old me makes me cringe. But yes, I've changed a lot, but I'm done changing. And then when they talked to 40-year-olds, it was, oh yeah, I've changed a ton since I was 30, but I'm not going to change anymore. I'm done. They called this something like the end of the world conclusion or something like that, meaning I'm not going to change anymore. I have, yes, people can, but I'm done. And that we don't kind of understand that we're always in a process of change. And what Jamil emphasized, he said, one thing we've learned in the past 50 to 100 years in psychology is that's really all we do. Our whole life is really a series of changes. It's not, yes, we change up until age this and stop, but we are constantly changing because of our influences, our communities, our exposure to information. Like, there's no way that we can't keep changing. Now, we can choose not to do good things with those changes or to recognize them, but that we are constantly in the state of change. So before I even go on, I just wanted to give you some space to chime in about what are your thoughts about, do people change over time?
Yes, well, I have been writing down some notes as you were speaking. And I think the first one is, what are the parameters of change that you're talking about? So if you were to ask me how much I changed, well, what are you talking about? Are you talking about fundamentals of my personality? Are you talking about more superficial things and all the things that are in between? And I would say that probably where the big arguments, and I would imagine that there are some sort of far-reaching and potentially divisive arguments when you think about all sorts of forms of rehabilitation, for example, that the real argument would come down to whether those fundamental parts of your personality can change, if that's what sort of influenced the reason that you need some form of rehabilitation, as an example. So that was sort of one thing. What are we talking about here? The second note I jotted down was that it would probably be a good idea to ask other people, ask people who know you well, not just you, whether you think you've changed or not, because obviously that is potentially quite a differing point of view. And then the last thing, when you say that we're always changing, the first thing that came to my mind was how we adapt to change. Our ability to adapt to change is very important because, as you say, things around us are in constant flux, really. They're always changing. But I can see potentially issues. One of the things that came to my mind, especially as we get older, a lot of us become less and less, not necessarily able. Maybe we have less of a desire to change, get more stuck in our ways. That whole, can you teach an old dog new tricks kind of thing. There's probably that maybe stereotypical. The older you get, the more set in your ways you get, and the less likely you are to want to adapt to the inevitable changes that go on around you. So all those things like, back in my day, and, having to get used to, especially things like technology, that changes so fast that for people who are older, who remember, the analog days, that people who are born in the last, I don't know, however many, 10 years, maybe more, who don't even know what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Those were the things that came to my mind.
I also have thought about it too, as someone trained as a psychologist, I don't think I would have gone into the field if I didn't think people could change. Mm. Sometimes when clients or others would ask me about that, I don't think we just suddenly become a completely different person. I think the change is often slow and, like you said, sometimes not perceivable by people outside of us. Sometimes it is. But also, we sometimes lack the awareness of our changing. How often do you walk by a mirror and you don't notice that your hair has grown? And then all of a sudden someone says, oh, you're wearing your hair different. You're like, oh, it's grown. I didn't even notice, because you're aware of it every day. So you don't see the change as much. So
exactly.
I do think people can change, and I don't think it's often drastic and fast. So I think that's another piece to kind of add to it.
Yeah, well, it's a bit like, that's a kind of a good follow-on from last week's recording when we were talking about New Year's resolutions. And, one of the points that you made, and one of the pitfalls that a lot of people fall into, is wanting to make a drastic change, wanting to make a perceivable change. But as you say, the reality is, and actually it can happen quite quickly, but because you're seeing it every minute, every day, whatever it is, you don't see the change. But somebody else might see actually quite a significant change, whatever it is you're doing, in as little as a week or a month, or, whatever it is. Perception is key, isn't it? But expectation and perception and perspective, all these things come into play.
And like you said, it's kind of, what are the parameters? What do we even mean by change? I'm not going to become a totally different person by next year.
Yeah.
But I might become more grateful or, something. So they talk about several things. And I know when I first mentioned the topic, you're like, oh, yeah, that's a good one. I don't feel like anyone would listen to this and have like a handbook on how to be less cynical. But I think they talk about some good concepts in here. So first, they kind of go back to his first book and talk a little bit about empathy. So, of course, being a faculty member, he's doing a lot of research. So looking at people, and again, how do we measure these things? I don't know. But in this study, when they looked at people who have more empathy, he said that empathic people tend to be happier and less stressed. They report lower levels of depression and loneliness. They excel in their work. And in general, empathy helps us navigate the world. Because we are fundamentally social creatures, empathy is a very important ability. It helps us to stay connected and feel connected. And it also helps people around us. Empathic teachers benefit their students. Empathic bosses benefit their employees. So the idea that empathy helps both us and those around us. And again, they went through this idea about, can we change? Because many people have thought of empathy as one of those kind of personality traits you either have or you don't, that somehow it's kind of genetically linked or something.
Bit of a gender bias there as well, probably.
Absolutely. And he talked about a concept that he called empathy gym, like thinking of it just like you can go to the gym and work on developing tone and stamina and things by repeatedly working on these skills. That's the same thing as empathy. It's a skill. It's not a trait. It's not something you're born with or not. It is something that we can develop. And so if it's something we can develop and it has all of these positive outcomes, it seems like it's worth thinking about and focusing on. And of course, then he talks a little bit about how do we increase our empathy. And he talked some about exposure, getting more exposure to other people's experiences. And improving empathy is really helped by having contact and immersing ourselves with people who are different than us. The more they're the same, it's not stretching our empathy muscle. We get it already.
It's much easier to be empathetic when somebody's experiencing the same thing as you.
That's right.
It's a good way to start tapping into it, having said that, if it's something that you really struggle with.
Mm-hmm.
There were a couple of things specifically about empathy that, again, jotting down my notes, but when you were talking about practicing, it made me think, and probably dramas about serial killers and sociopaths, psychopaths. I know there's a big difference, but one of the things is that lacking of empathy, but also certain personality types or certain, I'm not going to put my foot in it by naming various things that I don't know enough about. But if a lack of empathy is just something that you have in your makeup, genetic or otherwise, that you sort of don't have control over, I know that some people have to learn empathy and almost not exactly fake it, but they have to just practice the routine of it. So there was sort of that side of it. But then the general thing for people, when you said about people in general, the more empathetic they are, the less incidence of depression, less stress, generally more happy. And it made me think of the things we've recently discussed and is quite in the forefront of my mind, volunteering as an example. There are things that you can do to go and practice it that you actually don't have to think too much about, that have been proven to increase empathy. So you don't have to think, oh, well, this sounds really complicated, potentially. How am I going to go about that? There are some things you can do, or probably some, like you were saying, that they say, engage with people who aren't like you. And there are probably some, very typical questions to ask or ways to think. There are some steps to follow that make it very easy, that you're just going to naturally increase your empathy levels, potentially without even realizing. But maybe the way you realize is that you get some of the external benefits, like feeling less stressed, more happy, etc. I just thought, interesting.
Another complication with empathy is, as with many skills, if we don't see a purpose in it, we don't invest in developing it. And so when I think of some folks who really lack empathy, I probably don't think that it's a hardwired thing that they just can't. I think of it more that they don't have in their mind, they don't have a good reason to have empathy. What good is it going to do? And so, of course, it goes along with certain diagnoses in the psychiatric world. But it's that if I see that there's value in it, that it is a way for me to connect with people, it is a way for me to feel more connected, it's a way for me to help myself, maybe it's worth putting some effort into. But I think that's a big piece of it. People who lack empathy don't have a sense that there is a good purpose for it, for their own wounded reasons or whatever. So again, why would I go to the gym and work out if I don't think I need more muscle tone or better balance or stamina? There's no motivation to it. So I think that's another factor for people as well. So things like learning that volunteering can help me in all these ways. Now there's motivation to work on those skills. Mm-hmm. Very good. So in his second book, he talks about hope for cynics. And Chris Duffy, the host, said, this is kind of counterintuitive to even those words together, hope and cynics. And he talked about what Jamal writes about called hopeful skepticism. Again, sounds like an oxymoron.
Mm-hmm.
And so he asked him, can you help us understand this better? Jamil said that one of the challenges is that so often we misperceive that skepticism and cynicism are the same. And first, he wants to kind of separate those out. And he says that cynicism is a blanket assumption that most people are greedy, dishonest, untrustworthy, and that it leads to all sorts of negative consequences. Whereas skepticism isn't a particular belief about the nature of people. It's more a belief that I don't have all the data that I need to make a conclusion about that. And until I have that data, I'm not going to make a conclusion. That's skepticism.
Yeah, it's almost like the step before, isn't it? If you're skeptical, the more skeptical you are, the more you're going to tend towards being a cynical person.
Which is a good thing. And that's why he talks about hopeful skepticism. If I go into it thinking, I might learn good things if I keep gathering data versus, well, because people are all at the root evil, I'm not just being skeptical. I'm being, globally damning of it. So first, he just wanted to separate out those two ways that we often confuse it. So that was one skill that he talked about developing is hopeful skepticism. And then he moves more into talking about cynicism. And he said, unfortunately, there's kind of some cultural glamorizing of cynicism in that people think that cynical people are really more intelligent and less likely to be caught unaware. They're going to know that someone's going to rob them or cheat them out of something because they already believe it. And he called this concept of how we think maybe that cynical people are more intelligent, he called it the cynical genius illusion, because it turns out that most people hold that stereotype that if you're cynical, it's really a sign of intelligence, and that very intelligent people are naturally cynical. So there's a little study, and they talked to people, of course, and they asked people, who's smarter, cynics or non-cynics? And about 70% said that cynics are smarter than non-cynics. They go on to ask, who would be able to pick out a liar from someone telling the truth? So they give some details. 85% of people in this study think that cynics will be better lie detectors. So they think that these cynics have a better way of reading people. But it turns out that in study after study, cynics do less well than non-cynics on cognitive tests, on math tests, on analytical tests. They actually score less well. And it, in some ways, based on what you and I have already said, it almost makes sense because they have shut themselves off from needing to gather more data. I just already know people are horrible. I don't need to learn to read them.
Yeah.
I don't need to know how to look for clues. And so I think this is just so fascinating that a perception that so many people hold, that is a way to be smarter and show that you're smarter, it's actually more limiting.
Yes, I think more and more people are just prone to lumping everyone in the same category. When you were talking about 80% would think that somebody who's cynical would be more likely to spot somebody who's telling a lie. Whereas I was thinking, well, I would probably fall into the 20% because actually I would think that somebody who's more empathetic would be more likely to be able to spot a lie because they'd be more in tune with what's going on in that person's face, the kind of feelings they might be, that might be sort of leaking out of their pores, as it were. But also I was thinking the catch-all that people who pigeonholed as being empathetic, the other things that go into that pigeonhole are soft, a pushover, a doormat, all these things. And I think, again, the whole gender bias comes in a bit here as well. Probably if you were asked to think of, who would be the first person who would come to mind if somebody asked you to think of an empathetic person, and who would be the first person to spring to mind if you were to think of someone who was cynical, Chances are good, I would say, if you were to do a study on that more would fall on the male side for cynical and female for empathetic. I may be wrong, but I don't think I am. I think it's really interesting, this thinking about the difference between skepticism and cynicism. And when you first mentioned about potentially becoming less cynical, the first thing that came to my mind was the big change that I experienced going way back to our first episode here, I think it was, when I talked about gratitude, the gratitude journal that I did, and how that was a really significant change in my life. And I think probably that's exactly what I said, that I generally became less cynical, that I was quite aware that I was a bit too much of a cynical person.
Mm-hmm.
And it trained me very quickly, because it was a 30-day experiment. And I noticed changes way before that. But I also noticed at the end of that I was very aware that I'd made a significant shift in my personality, in my approach to life. So even if you're a cynical person, if you think you're a cynical person, there are things you can do to change that a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And it struck me that if you're aware that you're often skeptical, that's the part of the process. If we're thinking that skepticism is a sort of a step towards potentially being cynical too often, when you're skeptical and being aware of when you're skeptical, that's the step in the process to sort of jump in and just be aware that your tendency isn't too often to jump from skepticism to cynicism. Just be aware of that. It's not that well-worn path in that direction too often, to make sure, as you said, that you stay open and hopeful. And probably that's what he talks about, developing this hopeful skepticism, is being aware of the journey that you travel when you get to that point, and to try and stay open to going in different directions.
So many important things in what you said, Daisy. And you actually touch on, like I said, I don't think anyone's going to walk away with a guidebook. I think when he got to the point about what to really do about our cynicism, the conversation was a little less robust, but you just highlighted it. It's building in the skill, finding ways to challenge our own cynicism. And being skeptical is one of the ways to do it. And I know for some of us that's going to sound really contradictory because they both sound negative. But being skeptical of our cynicism is one of the things he talked about as one of the things to do to become less cynical.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see skeptical as being negative, but that's probably because I'm a questioner. So I'm skeptical all the time.
You're like, it's a necessity. But I think in general, the words for many people sound very similar. They're skeptical, they're cynical, blah, blah, blah. But instead, to question our own cynicism and recognize, I don't have all the information right now. I'm making an assumption. What if I slow down and get more information? So he talked about really there are kind of 3 general ways, and that is think differently, act differently, and share differently. So you just highlighted for us the first one is think differently. Act differently, for him, he talked about he's very much an introvert. And so it's very easy for him to kind of only focus on more cynical things and not gather data. And so he will force himself to go into a gathering and purposely talk to people to challenge his own assumptions. Because if he just stands in the corner and watches, he's going to make all kinds of erroneous conclusions. So instead, he acts differently. He goes in and gets information and starts to learn about people. And then the third is to share differently, meaning give people positive feedback. Say to your 3rd grade teacher, hey, you really made a difference in my life. And by us highlighting the positive and the impact like that, or the gratitude, We help show ourselves that people are good. We help remind ourselves that people have good qualities and things. We don't have to be so cynical. And one of the examples he gave about this is they did a study where they asked, I think it was college students, but they asked people in a certain population, about people. Like, do you think people care about you? Do you think people would help you? Because what they found is that people weren't asking for help. They were going through struggles and crises, but not seeking help. And it was because they believed people didn't care, people didn't want to help, they were a burden. And what they found in this study, once they gave them some information, 90% of people in your population said they like helping people. If they just gave the people who had been struggling that information, they suddenly were less cynical about people. Now they believed they could trust them. They could go to them with their concerns. They didn't do anything else but give them one piece of information that said, actually, people care. So questioning our cynicism, changing our behaviors, doing some things that put us in a way to gather more information, and then share our feedback, or even just share the impact that people have on us. And I know that is just one example, but I think these are his three main pieces. It made me, I know I say this often, and I don't know that I'll do it, but it really did make me curious about these books, because these aren't topics I think about often, but as I was listening to them, I thought, this is good stuff, because we do live in a complicated world. And they went on to talk about mean world syndrome, where people who are watching the news and reading the news, one, we're getting biased information. It's all portrayed in certain directions. It's to make certain ideas or actions or whatever look bad. And we then believe the world is a really horrible place and everything is bad. From the year 1990 to 2020, 27 surveys were given to people, asking them their perception of how bad things were as far as crime and things. And unanimously, people thought, it's horrible, it's getting worse, it just keeps getting worse, like just doom and gloom. But when they look at that same 30-year span, the FBI here in the US reports that certain types of crime that were being talked about actually decreased by 50%.
I can believe it.
But that's not what we see in the news.
No, it's the perception.
And we don't see the thousands and hundreds and thousands and millions of people who are finding solutions for problems, who are doing good things. Those aren't the things that get put in these sources that we're looking at. So he didn't say necessarily that means none of us should ever read a newspaper again or ever watch the news, but that we do have to really be aware of the potential for us to be skewed in our perception when that's all we're seeing. So again, I think back to your example of volunteering. When you volunteer, you go find people who are good people. You find people who are helping them. You're one of them. And that helps counterbalance this just doom and gloom view that we can get with this mean world syndrome.
Yes, and I like the suggestion also to actively look to engage with people who are different from you. Because the first thing that came to my mind, well, the two things that came to my mind, but was, I would say, the perception of things getting worse overall, almost probably completely comes down to the increase in the tendency towards divisiveness, particularly in social media, but that ends up being, in mainstream media, news channels, all the rest of it. And the encouragement, I would say there's a natural tendency, but also an encouragement to end up in silos. And we've talked about this before as well, haven't we? And increasingly, I think that happens more and more. There are people I see on social media. There's one guy in particular who I really must stop following. There's just sort of natural curiosity that I keep looking at his posts and haven't taken, and maybe actually it's a good thing too, because I tend to curate my feed probably a little bit too much, or definitely a little bit too much. But there's this whole, it's the cynical people who are the smart people, and they get lumped into being the far right. And that has gone from smaller discussions in social media, outside social media, on social media, onto news channels. I find it very alarming that people get lumped into different categories, whatever it is. But far right, quote unquote, is something that relatively recently has started appearing more and more on mainstream news channels. Not that I watch it that often, and I do find it alarming, because for me, far right is going back to days when I was younger for really what you'd consider far right, the skinheads going out on the streets and causing mayhem. Again, it's stereotypical, but you get my feeling. But a lot of people, especially of a certain age, have a very specific feeling about what that means. And more people are getting lumped into that category. And, this guy would fall into that category and would probably be, in a lot of ways, quite happy to be in that category, but very much presents himself, I'm the smart one. And anyone else who questions my point of view is a sheep. So he would probably say, if you're too empathetic, if you don't question things enough, or how he thinks you question things, you're a sheep. So you're either one thing or the other. And of course, most of us are somewhere in between. But I do think this, harnessing the power of skepticism and thinking of skepticism as a two-way process. So you're not just skeptical about external things, you're skeptical about yourself, you're skeptical about your beliefs. And think of words like you mentioned about challenging, questioning, not only what other people do, not only the messages that are coming in and that you're taking on board, but what your feelings are about things and the messages you're putting out. So if you think of all these things as multi-directional, actually, really embracing this whole, what is skepticism and how can I use it as a much more powerful tool?
They also talked about how, in social groups, if 20 people, let's say, are working on something together, it often only takes one person who says, this won't work.
Yeah.
We can't do this.
Negativity bias.
To sway everyone. And so it's like, even challenge, be skeptical of, what is that person really saying? And be open to, wait, there are 18 other people besides that person and me. I bet there are other people who have other thoughts and other abilities and things. So it was an interesting conversation. And obviously I can tell by how many responses you have today. It sounds like a valuable topic to you as well.
Really interesting. Yeah. And I was just thinking quickly before we go, in that example you just gave, it is quite often the more strident cynic who will speak up in that environment than the person who has a bit more empathy.
Absolutely.
Probably, overall, the chances are good. Yeah.
And we'll have more power.
Yeah.
If 5 people say, I think we can do this, I think this makes a lot of sense, and one person says, this is doomed, it won't work, can't do this, it biases everything.
Yeah. Well, yes, indeed. Very interesting subject. It sounds like those books would be good. I'm going to rely on you to go and listen to them and report.
Uh-oh, we're in trouble then.
Challenge thrown down. Yeah, so I hope I can come back next week with something equally as interesting. That I'm a little skeptical. That feels like a big challenge.
But notice, skeptical, not cynical.
Absolutely. Yes, I am open to it going either way. But in the meantime, I hope you and everyone at home has a very wonderful week.
Take good care, everyone.